He thought the wild had let her go. 5 years, no trace, no sound, no paw print in the snow. But then one morning, a retired ranger opened his door and found a full-grown lynx sitting on his porch. And she wasn't alone. What could make a wildcat return to a man after half a decade of silence? And why had she brought a trembling kitten with her? This isn't just a story of survival. It's a revelation, a haunting, heart-healing reminder that some bonds, no matter how wild, aren't broken by time, but strengthened by it. What happened next shocked everyone. Stay with us. The sky was still dark when the first sound broke the silence. Not the wind through Douglas fir, nor the rustle of a distant crow. This was softer, closer. A thump, like the landing of something heavy but careful, padded against old wood. Walt McCrae stirred in his armchair before dawn, a mug of cold tea on the side table, his dog-eared copy of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek resting on his lap. The wood stove was down to a faint glow. Outside, the fog clung to the valley like breath held in a chest. Another sound, a low, rhythmic scrape, claws on porch planks. He rose slowly, every joint speaking, drew back the curtain. There, in the faint blue of early light, stood a shadow. No, not stood. Sat, poised, unmoving, a wild cat. Walt didn't blink. The lynx was nearly the size of a German shepherd, with thick, silver-grey fur and tufted ears that flicked at some unheard sound. Snow-mottled paws rested like stones on the wood. Her eyes met his through the glass, amber, steady, impossibly calm. "Kiva," he whispered, the name catching in his throat like a secret thought spoken aloud. She hadn't changed, not really, just grown into what she'd always been meant to be. Wild, whole, unreachable. But it wasn't just her presence that froze him. It was the second pair of eyes. Lower, smaller, peeking out from behind her hind legs. A kitten. No older than a few months, half the size with matted fur and trembling limbs. Walt opened the door. Kiva didn't move, just turned her head slightly toward the tree line. And then, quietly, deliberately, she stepped off the porch and disappeared into the mist. The kitten stayed. The road to Walt McCrae's cabin twisted like an old spine through the forest, paved in memory more than asphalt. It was the kind of place a map forgot, where GPS signals flickered, and only locals knew which rock slide had rerouted the stream. Walt liked it that way. Out here near Blinn, the land breathed slow and deep, and if you listened hard enough, you could hear what it remembered. He had lived alone for nearly a decade now, ever since Barbara passed. He didn't speak of her often, not even to the forest that had once been his companion. She was gone in the quiet way some things disappear, not in thunder or heartbreak, but like fog burned off by morning sun. Still, her absence lived in the empty mug beside his own, in the faded quilt folded precisely at the end of the bed, in the way he sometimes turned to say something, only to stop mid-breath. At 68, Walt was still strong, though the mountain trails had taken their toll. His knees clicked like old gate hinges, and his left shoulder caught when the rain came in. But his eyes, those sharp, ranger eyes, still held the glint of someone who could read a track in mud like a sentence. Each morning, he woke before the birds, not out of habit, but reverence. Coffee boiled on the wood stove. He stepped outside barefoot, even in cold, to feel the land beneath him. Not as a man staking claim, but as someone asking permission. The cabin sat on a small rise overlooking a glacial creek. No neighbors, no traffic, just the trees, the deer, and the occasional fox that left prints near his tool shed. In summer, the salmon came. In winter, the silence grew thicker than snow. He used to patrol these woods for the Forest Service, back when his uniform still fit and his radio crackled with purpose. People called him Walt the Wild Man, part guide, part ghost. He was the one they sent to find hikers who strayed too far, or to relocate a bear who'd learned the scent of trail mix. But retirement came like a landslide. Suddenly he was home, without calls, without reason. And that's when the dreams began. Soft fur brushing past his hands. Yellow eyes watching from the treetops. The sound of something breathing just beyond the frame of the window. For a while, he'd tried volunteering, a few shifts at the Raptor Center, a couple of firewood deliveries to the tribal elders downriver. But something in him had closed. Not from bitterness. Walt McCrae was not a bitter man, just from something quieter. A tiredness that didn't ache, but hummed. He'd become a caretaker of stillness. He split logs with a reverence bordering on ritual. Cleaned his shotgun, though he hadn't fired it in years. Recorded the dates of first frost, last snowfall, and the rare appearance of elk in the eastern meadow. The kind of life that felt like it was waiting for something, though he couldn't say what. And then came the night, 5 years ago, when he heard the cry in the trees. It had been raining, the kind of sideways rain the peninsula knew intimately. Walt had just stoked the fire when it came, sharp, desperate, unnatural, not owl, not fox, too raw for a coyote. It came again. A yowl cut short. Walt took the lantern and stepped outside, the beam cutting ribbons through the storm. That's when he found her. A bundle of soaked fur beneath a cedar stump, no bigger than his boot, spotted, limp, a lynx, unmistakably. Her body shivered with every breath, ribs rising like fragile scaffolding. He should have called someone. He didn't. Instead, he wrapped her in an old flannel shirt and brought her inside, set her on a folded towel near the stove. He watched her all night. At one point, her paw twitched. Then her eyes opened. Wild, golden, feral. But she didn't run. She just blinked, and so began a bond neither asked for, yet neither seemed willing to break. The next morning, the rain had softened to mist, and the first light touched the edges of Walt's windows like a whisper. He hadn't slept, not really, just sat in the rocker by the hearth, keeping watch. The kitten hadn't moved much through the night, save for the rise and fall of her breath. Damp and weak, she lay on the towel like something caught between this world and the next. Her fur was matted with pine needles and flecks of dried blood. Tiny cuts marked her legs, her lip. Her left eye blinked slower than the right, but she was alive, somehow, still alive. Walt crouched beside her now, knees groaning, and extended one hand, not to touch, just to be there. His fingers trembled slightly, from the cold or from something deeper. The kitten stirred, her ears twitching. She didn't hiss, just blinked, slow and cautious. "That's it," he murmured. "You made it through the night. Good girl." He wasn't sure when he started calling her that. Maybe because it felt right, maybe because names gave weight to things, made them stay. He brought over a shallow bowl of water and set it down a few feet away. Then a scrap of chicken from last night's stew, torn into slivers. She didn't move at first. Then, a twitch of her nose, a shuffle. She dragged herself closer, moving like a winded fawn. Her tongue flicked out, tentative, tasting. The water went first, then a single bite, then more. Walt exhaled softly. as if he'd been holding that breath since the night before. He stayed there, watching. Not just to be sure she ate, but because something about the moment felt sacred, like watching a star form or the first crack in ice before spring. By noon, she'd made it to the rug near the stove, curling her thin body into a ball. Walt laid out another towel, placed a second bowl beside her. And then he did something that surprised even himself. He talked, not in full sentences at first, just the odd phrase here and there. A muttered observation. Storm's letting up. That creek's going to be high come nightfall. You've got spirit, little one. And she listened. Not with comprehension, maybe, but with presence. She blinked in rhythm with his voice, turned her head when he moved. When he reached for the kettle, she watched every motion like it mattered. That evening, Walt sat on the porch with his coffee. The rain had given way to clouds, low and soft like worn cotton. He looked out across the trees, watching steam rise from the forest floor. There was something ancient about the way mist clung to the ferns, the way light filtered down in ribbons through mossy branches. He felt the pull of it, that wildness, that ache. And he wondered, what if she'd never cried out? What if he'd stayed inside, let nature be? But the truth pressed heavier than the what-ifs. She had cried out. And he had answered. Back inside, the lynx had found the corner near the woodbox. She lay there now, chest rising slow and even, her tail short and thick, flicked once at a falling ember. Walt smiled. She's got fight, he whispered, half to himself, half to the air. He didn't call the rangers, not that day, not the next. He rationalized it, told himself it was temporary, just until she could stand on her own, just until she regained her strength. But as the days passed, it became harder to imagine the cabin without her in it. Not because she demanded space, she didn't. She moved like a ghost, silent and light-footed. She slept most of the day, stretched long across the rug. But her presence, it shifted something. Walt began to rise earlier, not just from habit, but from want. He cleaned more, cooked better meals, read aloud sometimes, just to fill the quiet. "You need a name," he said one morning as she sat blinking beside the window. The word came like a memory. Kiva. He'd heard it on a reservation patrol years ago, a Hopi word. It meant a shelter, a chamber of prayer, of safety. "You're protected," he told her. "And maybe you're protecting me too." Kiva, she wore it like a secret. By the end of the week, she was walking again, lopsided at first, then surer. She explored the cabin with a quiet curiosity, sniffing every corner, brushing her whiskers against each worn baseboard. Her favorite spot became the narrow windowsill above the sink, where the sun touched just right in the mornings. Walt watched her grow each day, not just in strength, but in certainty. Her eyes, once clouded by fear, now held something more, awareness, presence, a question unspoken. He built a makeshift perch from old firewood, lined it with wool. He left the back door unlatched, just in case she wanted out. She didn't take it, not yet. Outside, the snow came early. Frost laced the edges of the windows. Walt split extra wood. Kiva followed him around the yard, pausing every few feet to sniff a branch or paw at a snowdrift. Once, she chased a leaf until her back legs slipped and she tumbled into a pile of cedar needles. Walt laughed so hard he scared a crow from the eaves. That night, she curled beside the stove, her breath slow and even. Walt lay in bed, listening. The wind had died. The world outside was still, and for the first time in years, so was he. The forest pressed close in winter, draping the hills in silence thick enough to hear your heartbeat. Out here, the snow didn't just fall, It settled, like it had chosen this valley for its stillness. Walt watched it from the porch most mornings, a flannel blanket over his lap, a cup of coffee warming his hands. Inside, Kiva stretched across the braided rug, her limbs longer now, her movement more fluid. She was shedding the look of a fragile orphan and stepping paw by paw into her wild form. Her spots darkened with age, her coat thickened, but she was still quiet, still watching. They had found a rhythm. Walt didn't cage her, never even tried. The door stayed unlocked, the window cracked. Freedom was her right. But each night she returned, sometimes with snow on her back, sometimes with a feather stuck in her fur. Always without explanation. She never hunted in front of him. Perhaps she thought it would disturb him, this thing inside her that pulsed with teeth and instinct. But once, on a morning walk near the eastern ridge, he found the remains of a grouse by the creek. The pattern of the kill told him everything. He knelt by the spot, brushing snow from the torn feathers, not with sadness, with awe. "She's learning," he whispered, "or remembering." Their days were quiet, but full. Walt chopped wood while Kiva prowled the edges of the yard. He talked to her more than he'd ever talked to people. About the shape of the clouds, the taste of memories, the ache in his knuckles. She listened, or at least made space for the words. At night, when the wind howled through the stovepipe, she would curl on the armchair beside his, her breath rising in sync with the flames. And for the first time since Barbara's passing, Walt didn't dread the long hours of dark. She was company. Not just comfort, but kin. One evening in February, he found her staring at the window, unmoving. Outside, a buck passed through the tree line, its hooves silent on the snow. Kiva didn't move. She just watched, ears twitching, body humming with tension. Walt stood beside her, not saying a word. When the buck disappeared, she blinked slowly and resumed her perch. He looked down at her. "You feel it too, don't you? The call of the trees. The pull of somewhere beyond walls and rugs and warm stoves." He knew she was changing. The next day, she didn't come in for breakfast. Her bowl of rabbit stew sat untouched. Walt stepped onto the porch, snow creaking beneath his boots. "Kiva?" He scanned the woods. No movement. He waited all day, kept the fire low, left the porch light on. She didn't return. That night, he didn't sleep, just sat in the rocker, listening for a sound that never came. By morning, her prints had faded. He searched the ridge, the creek, the thicket behind the shed. Nothing. He left meat on the porch for a week, then two, and then he stopped. Not because he gave up, but because he knew Kiva hadn't vanished. She'd returned to the wild, and he had to let her. But it wasn't grief that settled into him. Not exactly. It was something softer, a kind of ache that hummed in the background like a remembered song. She had grown strong. She had remembered who she was, and in doing so, she had reminded him who he had once been. The woods were no longer just a backdrop to his solitude. They were alive again, pulsing, breathing, waiting. In the months that followed, Walt found himself walking farther, longer. He packed a bag, traced old trails, marked the signs of elk in spring. He whistled as he walked, not for company, just because he could. He didn't see her again, not in those early months, but sometimes in the hush between two wind gusts, he swore he heard her paws in the leaves, or glimpsed a shimmer of grey fur between the trees. And once, just once, he found a rabbit pelt on the porch, clean, deliberate, left on the doormat like an offering. He didn't move it for 3 days, just sat beside it each morning, drinking his coffee. By summer, the snow had melted, the creek swelled with meltwater, and life, as it always did, moved on. But something had changed. The loneliness that once clung to Walt like damp wool had loosened. He still lived alone, yes. Still cooked for one, still spoke aloud to the wind, but he no longer felt forgotten. He had seen a creature remember him. And somehow, that made all the difference. The snowmelt revealed more than just rock and root. It uncovered the spaces in Walt's life he hadn't known were still closed. The porch no longer felt like a barrier. The trail behind the cabin, once walked only out of obligation, called to him like a familiar voice. Every tree he passed, every gust of wind, held the weight of her memory. Still months passed, spring turned to summer, and the ache of absence settled into something quieter. Not quite sorrow, not quite peace. A murmur. He left the back porch gate open each night, just in case. By the time September came, Walt was folding firewood into neat rows along the cabin wall. His hands, still strong despite their shake, worked by rhythm. Chop, stack, breathe. That morning, the air held a hush that made him pause mid-swing. A softness he recognized, the kind of stillness that came before a moment changed everything. When he turned, there was nothing there, no shape in the trees, no sound, and yet his chest tightened. That old wild tether pulled taut. "Don't do this to me," he muttered under his breath, voice cracking. He finished the stack, made stew, lit the fire, and that night he dreamt of her. Not as a kitten, small and trembling by the stove, but full-grown, eyes burning like sun through mist, her silhouette crowned by mountain light. He woke at dawn with a name on his lips. Kiva. He didn't expect her anymore. He wouldn't allow hope to bloom where she had once stood. But still, every time a branch snapped outside or the wind changed, he looked. Then one morning, 5 years to the day since she'd arrived, she returned. But not alone. Walt stepped out to the porch in his slippers, mug in hand. The air was crisp, the sun low and gold, and there, curled on the top step like she'd never left, was Kiva, bigger, wilder, but unmistakable. Her ears twitched at his breath, her eyes met his. He froze. She blinked once, then stepped aside. And there it was, a kitten, no older than 6 weeks, thin, uncertain, its paws too big for its frame, its eyes too tired for its age. Walt crouched, his knees screaming. The kitten didn't run, just stared at him. Kiva watched from behind. She didn't come closer, didn't make a sound, just stood like a sentinel at the edge of the porch. Walt's breath hitched. Oh, girl. The kitten wobbled forward. Walt set down his mug, opened his arms slowly. The kitten crept in, hesitated, then pressed against his flannel shirt, trembling. Kiva let out a breath that sounded almost like a sigh, and then, as silently as she'd come, she turned and walked back toward the trees. Walt stood, clutching the small, broken thing against his chest. "Kiva!" he called once, but she didn't turn. At the tree line she paused, lifted her head toward the sun, and disappeared. He didn't follow, just stood there, the morning light catching in his eyes, his heartbeat loud enough to drown the silence. He looked down at the kitten in his arms. No more than a breath, a heartbeat. Wild, yes, but still holding on. His throat tightened. "All right," he whispered. "Let's get you warm." The porch door creaked shut behind him. The kitten, barely more than bones and fuzz, slept curled in a cardboard box lined with wool. Walt had set it by the stove, just as he had for Kiva years ago. The routine came back like breath, water, food, warmth. Only this time his hands trembled more, and the silence that filled the cabin felt different. The kitten didn't cry, it didn't hiss, it simply existed, as if exhaustion had carved out all the sound inside it. Walt watched its tiny chest rise and fall. The tremble in its limbs, the way one paw twitched when the wind howled outside. He thought of Kiva's eyes that morning, not pleading, not expectant, just trusting, as if to say, "You know what to do, I remember." He fed the kitten boiled chicken, mashed into mush. At first, it wouldn't eat. Walt placed the dish near the box and sat back, reading aloud in a low voice from a worn copy of a Sand County almanac. He didn't know why. Maybe the cadence soothed him. Maybe the words were a kind of medicine for them both. An hour later, the bowl was empty. That night, the kitten woke crying, a high-pitched mewl, soft but sharp enough to carve through the quiet. Walt sat up in bed, blanket falling to the floor. He walked barefoot to the stove. The kitten had pulled itself out of the box, dragged its body across the rug, and now stood, barely, at the foot of the armchair. Walt lifted it gently and tucked it into a folded towel on his lap. It let out one last whimper before curling into itself. He rocked gently, the way he had with his daughter when she was small. That memory surprised him. It arrived like a wind from a closed door. "I haven't held anything this small in 30 years, he whispered. In the morning, the kitten opened its eyes fully. Pale gold, rimmed with misty green. Not Kiva's, but close enough to stir something deep. He named it Ash, not for the color of its coat, though that too was soft and silver, but for the way it arrived, quiet, after the fire. Ash recovered faster than expected. Within days, it began limping after Walt across the room, tripping over the rug fringe, pouncing on dust motes. Its hunger surged, its voice returned. Every time Walt entered the room, Ash would chirp, tail stiff, head tilted. The bond was different than with Kiva. Kiva had been silent company, like a shadow in the corner of the room. She had never asked for touch, rarely made sound, always held something back, as if some part of her remained in the trees, even when her body rested near the fire. But Ash wanted closeness. Ash reached out. He'd wake to find the kitten curled in the crook of his neck. At dinner, tiny claws would tap at his socked foot until he dropped a scrap of meat. At night, Ash would press his face to the window and watch the woods, waiting for what Walt didn't know. Once, he asked aloud, "Are you waiting for her?" Ash didn't answer, just blinked slowly and rested his head on his paws. Walt began journaling again, something he hadn't done since Barbara. Just a few lines each night. September 21st. Ash climbed the bookshelf. "Knocked down Thoreau. I told him that was brave." September 28th. No sign of her, but the woods feel full. October 3rd. I'm not lonely. I didn't think that was still possible. The neighbors, what few he had, didn't know. He didn't want them to. This was his, the cabin, the quiet, the wild between his door and the tree line. And now, this creature Kiva had delivered like a secret message. He wondered how she had known that he would be here, that he would still say yes. Ash was learning fast, hunting shadows, tracking sounds Walt couldn't hear. Once, Ash brought a moth to his lap, proud and humming with instinct. Walt praised him like a father would. "You're not just healing," he said one night, running a finger behind one tufted ear. "You're remembering, same as she did." The kitten purred. It was just before dawn when Walt woke to the sound of something shifting beyond the porch. Not loud, just enough to disturb the rhythm of crickets, creek, and wind. Ash, already alert, leapt from the bed and padded silently toward the door, fur bristling. Walt followed, slower, heart thumping in that old familiar way, a mixture of dread and wonder. He pulled the curtain back. Nothing. Just the soft grey wash of fog clinging to the trees, the porch rail wet with dew. Ash pressed a paw against the door, his body trembling with an energy Walt hadn't seen in him before. Walt opened it. The kitten slipped out like smoke. Walt stood there, half inside, half out, the cold morning biting at his bare arms. Ash paused at the edge of the porch, nose lifted to the wind. Then, without hesitation, he trotted toward the tree line, the same place Kiva had disappeared through all those months ago. Walt's instinct screamed, "Close the door. Call him back." Don't let him vanish, but he didn't. He just whispered, "Go on then," his voice catching. And Ash did. It wasn't the end, not yet. Ash returned that evening, soaked and shivering, but intact. In his mouth, a sprig of fur. No prey, no feather, just a branch. Walt understood it was a gift. The next few days changed everything. Ash grew restless. He slept less, watched the woods more. He no longer mewed when Walt left the room. He grew bolder, more curious. He began climbing, chairs, counters, then the shelves, until he perched like a sentinel near the kitchen window. The wild was calling. And this time, Walt didn't resist it. He began walking the perimeter again, showing Ash the trail markers he'd carved years ago, low scratches on tree trunks, notches in old cedar. Ash followed, mimicking every movement, stopping when Walt did, lifting his head to the same breeze. One afternoon, they found a deer carcass at the bottom of the ravine. Coyotes, likely. But Ash didn't flinch. He sniffed, circled. Then, as if understanding the cycle, he turned and padded back toward the cabin. He didn't need to be told. He was learning. And Walt, he was remembering. It struck him one night as he sat on the porch sipping hot cider, Ash asleep at his feet. This wasn't just a gift from Kiva. It was a continuation, a circle drawn in soft paw prints and firelight. She hadn't just brought him a kitten, she'd brought him purpose. That fall, Walt built a second perch out near the edge of the clearing, a flat slab of stone beneath a young alder. Ash took to it like a throne. Each morning, he'd watch the sun rise from that spot, blinking as light threaded through the clouds. Walt started carving again, tiny notches into driftwood he found along the creek. Symbols, simple but meaningful. One for Kiva, one for Ash, one for the space between them that no word could quite name. The cabin, once too quiet, now buzzed with life. Birds came closer, squirrels lingered longer. Even the ravens watched Walt with new interest, perching near the stovepipe like old neighbors returning from war. Then one dusky evening in November, the air changed. It wasn't the cold, that had already arrived. It was something deeper. An alertness, the kind that makes animals freeze mid-step. Ash was at the edge of the yard, staring. Walt followed his gaze, and there, half shrouded in mist, stood Kiva. She looked older now, thicker ruff around her neck, scar across her flank. Her eyes held more than recognition. They held distance. She wasn't here to stay. Ash bounded forward, stopped, looked back. Walt nodded once, barely breathing. Kiva stepped forward, just enough to close the space between them. Ash reached her, touched noses, then sat back on his haunches, ears flicking, waiting. Walt understood. Kiva turned, walked back toward the woods. Ash stayed still. Then looked at Walt and returned to the porch. That night, Walt didn't sleep. He sat with Ash, the fire casting long shadows across the rug, and whispered. She came back, just to see. Ash looked up, blinked. His purr began, a low, contented rumble that filled the room like a lullaby. Walt closed his eyes. He didn't know how long he had, a season, a year, maybe less. But he did know this. The bond they had, all three of them, wasn't built on ownership or need. It was memory. It was trust. It was something the wild itself had drawn between them. A path not written on any map, a circle rekindled. The air grew colder in November. Frost crept in patterns across the window panes, and each morning brought a hush that seemed to hold its breath. Walt sat by the fire, journal in hand, a half-finished sentence on the page. There are things the forest forgets, and some it never will. Ash lay curled beside the hearth, tail flicking in his sleep. Every so often, his ears twitched, chasing dreams Walt would never know. Outside, the trees stood bare, skeletal against the fog. The wind moved through them like a voice with no words. Walt looked toward the porch door. He hadn't seen Kiva again, but her presence hadn't left. Sometimes it came in the pattern of paw prints that appeared overnight in the frost-dusted mud. Sometimes in the single raven feather left by the perch. Once, he found a small pile of stones stacked beneath the alder tree. Too deliberate to be chance, and always in Ash's gaze, when he paused mid-play and stared into the woods as if remembering something too old for language. Walt thought about those 5 years. About the moment he chose to lift a dying kitten from a storm. About the mornings he woke to silence and didn't mind. About the wild thing that taught him how to sit still with sorrow, and the second one that taught him how to move again. He traced the scar on his wrist, faint from a log splitter years back. But now it felt symbolic. The place where something had once broken, healed into something stronger. "I thought I saved her," he said aloud, voice quiet over the crackle of the fire. "But maybe I was just staying alive long enough for her to save me." Ash stirred, opened one golden eye, watched him. The fire snapped softly. Outside, the wind turned. Ash rose slowly, padded to the window, and sat, his eyes fixed on the tree line, ears alert, waiting, watching. And Walt smiled. Not because he saw anything, not because he expected her to come, but because something inside him understood. The wild does not forget. Not truly. And some stories, like rivers and roots, keep moving long after they vanish from sight. He closed his journal. "If this story touched your heart," he whispered, "stay close. Here on Paw Prints and Stories, we believe some bonds never end.